What's up, guys? This is Xander Bennett from The Rare Candy here, and today I'm really excited to not necessarily start a new series, but to extend out a past series that we've done. We're going to be doing more top 10s than just the top 10s for each set. This is going to be the top 10 water Pokemon. Going to go through a bunch of different stuff through all of Pokemon's history and all the different types, and this is going to be the first installment of that series. So we're going to have the top 10 and 2 honorable mentions before we get started. Before we're doing all that, start thinking about what you think the top water Pokemon are going to be. See how many of them you can get right and follow along in this top 10. The only thing that we're doing special on here is that we're going to try not to repeat the same Pokemon on here more than once. So certain Pokemon, the Pokemon Company has favorited printing multiple times in a row, so we're going to try to limit it to the best iteration of that Pokemon just to have a little bit of differentiation on this list. But that's going to be the ground rules for our top 10. We're looking at cards through all of Pokemon's history. So many different eras are going to be on here, so it could be a history lesson for you, but just time to enjoy talking about some of these awesome water-type Pokemon. Coming in as our first honorable mention, you can call this number 12 or 11, however you want to do it, tied for 11th if you want, is Wailord EX. Wailord EX was a crazy 250 HP basic Pokemon, which at the time, whenever this was printed in Primal Clash, was seemingly never heard of. We're far past there for now, but a 250 HP basic is still a lot to this day, even though the attack damage might have caught up to it. It has an ability called Water Veil that says whenever you attach an energy card from your hand to this Pokemon, remove all special conditions from it, and then for 5 water, you can do High Breaching for 120, and this Pokemon is now asleep. This Pokemon is honestly kind of hilarious just because it has a ability and an attack that the decks that this was most prominent in never really use. Wailord famously got second at 2015 Nationals. Enrique Alvia played it along with Michael Lukes and 4 other people. In an old article that I wrote on the Roll of the Dice that has since been taken down, I calculated the win percentage out for it, and the win rate versus the loss and tie rate was like triple. So this deck super succeeded at that tournament. I believe that everyone who played it got top 64 in their pod. Only top 32 advanced into day 2, but just crazy percentages for this deck at 2015 Nationals. That style of deck where you have the big basic surrounded by lots of healing cards and whatnot has made it through both formats for standard and expanded. Beach was added, and the last big finish for Wailord per se was November 2017 for San Jose. Drew Kennett won a regional, or top 8 of the regional with this deck, I'm sorry. But since then, the archetype has continued to evolve, and Wailord has been replaced a little bit. Magikarp and Wailord has came out as a 300 HP basic Pokemon that you can play if you would like to. But there's also Melmetal and Lucario GX, and Vileplume kind of being the newest way for this style archetype to exist. But Regigigas from Crimson Invasion has done this, Hoopa from Shining Legends, all just different examples of playing basics that are aggravating to your opponent so that they can struggle to knock you out, using the power of Lusamine and other card engines to get this deck rolling. Outside of that, there was a deck that has attacked with us over in the past, and that's Archestois. Jacob Van Wagner, in his 2015 Worlds winning list, played a Wailord just because the Seismitoad decks and the Trevenant decks could have no way to take a knockout on this thing with Rough Seas involved. So on your first turn, since you normally get 1 turn of items, you just power up a Wailord with as many energies as you can on it, and the 120 over and over again. They're not going to have a way to beat that with all of your healing that you have from Rough Seas, especially because whenever you attach a water energy to Wailord, you can get rid of the status conditions from Hypnotoxic Laser. So Wailord, a highly effective card in those matchups. Saw play in expanded Argestois lists for a while, but has since been replaced again by Magikarp and Wailord GX being that 300 HP Pokemon that's so hard to deal with. So coming in as our first honorable mention is Wailord EX. Our next honorable mention on this list is Kingdra Prime. Kingdra Prime is a stage 2 130 HP water-type Pokemon that has the Pokepower Spray Splash. So once during your turn, you may put 1 damage counter on one of your opponent's Pokemon, and this power cannot be used if Kingdra is affected by a special condition. As well as for 1 water energy, you can use Dragon Steam for 60, and if your opponent has any fire Pokemon in play, this attack's base damage is 20 instead of 60. This card was mostly used for its ability to fix math in the 2011 era of the game, Heart Gold Soul Silver through Black and White. Both Reshiram and Zekrom had just come out and had 130 HP, which was a very new thing for basics at the time. So funny comparing that to Wailord that we had just talked about. But both of them had attacks that could only do 120. So Kingdra saw play as an effect that could replace plus power and just allow you to boost your damage throughout the whole game instead of trying to hit a one-time card. There is still lists that played plus power because of the power of Junk Arm. You could always use it. But certain Reshiram Typhlosion lists played it, as well as the World's Deck printed Yanmega Magnezone list played as thick of a 2-1-2 line of Kingdra. There were lists that played a 1-0-1 line of Kingdra to a 1-1-1. So a 2-1-2 is a really high commitment to a Kingdra line just to adjust the damage. In that deck, Yanmega could snipe 40 anywhere, so with Kingdra Prime, you could really start to hound on those bench Pokemon and just take as many knockouts on those as you can. And this card was also just randomly used with the Kingdra from Legends Awakened as kind of a Kingdra Donk deck that just tried to turbo out a bunch of Claydolls and just power up Kingdra as fast as they could before their opponent could get set up. Overall, that archetype wasn't super successful, and Kingdra makes it on the honorable mentions list just because it wasn't necessarily a fully archetype. It always had a supporting role, but always had a really unique one that was very effective in what it did. So Kingdra Prime as our second honorable mention. Coming in at number 10 is a card that I completely forgot about whenever I was making this list initially, so shout out to Eric for reminding me about it. It is Octillery from Breakthrough. Octillery is a Stage 1 90 HP Pokemon that has the ability Abyssal Hand. Once during your turn, you may draw until you have 5 cards in your hand, and then for Water colorless, you can do Hug for 40, and the defending Pokemon cannot retreat during your opponent's next turn. We are definitely not here for Hug, just here for Abyssal Hand. Abyssal Hand was a very strong ability that saw play in a lot of different decks throughout its time. Most recently, the Buzzwole Lycanroc deck has played it in both standard and expanded in some counts, just because you can search for Remoraid off of Brooklet Hill, just allowing that deck to have a consistency engine just to get up to 5 cards. And this card was really expensive for a while just because so many decks were playing it as a way just to draw up to 5 cards. There's not a whole ton to talk about for this card outside of that, just having a very strong ability allowing you to refresh your hand, protecting you from N in that format, and just effectively giving you a bonus supporter. So with all of those reasons combined, Octillery comes in at 10th on our top 10 list. Coming in at number 9 is Kyurem from Plasma Freeze. This is a 130 HP basic Pokemon with 2 different attacks that were both very powerful. For Water and a colorless, you could use Frost Spear for 30, and then the attack does 30 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. And then for Water colorless, you had Blizzard Burn, which for 120, you could not attack during your next turn with this Pokemon. The Team Plasma deck, also known as TDK, saw lots of success from as soon as this card came out until the deck rotated out of the format. After Plasma Freeze came out and shook up Standard, Ryan Sablehouse got second place at Nationals with it in 2013, losing to Gothitelle Excelgor, and then the deck also got second of Worlds that year in the hands of Simon Narode, losing to the Darkrai deck of Jason Klaczynski. The deck overall just able to use Deoxys' ability to power up all the attacks of the deck, turn these attacks that were pretty good on rate as is into an engine that was super consistent, with Kyurem being the main attacker of this deck. Outside of this, there was Colress Machine, which was just a very wild way to accelerate energy. Essentially, it was an item that netted you an extra energy attachment from your deck in the form of a plasma energy. So you had 4 of those and 4 Colress Machines, so you could essentially probably get 3 or 4 attachments per game as long as you draw your cards in the right way, just for free, allowing you to use this Blizzard Burn attack as early as turn 2. This card saw play even outside of that. There was a Water Box deck later on that played Aqua Patch, Max Elixirs, and cards like that, and Kyurem saw play in there as like a one-of attacker that could split some damage up. But the main thing is that this card was just such an efficient attacker in the TDK deck that it saw play in Standard and a little bit of early Expanded before that format was super developed, just being able to do such high damage for such low rates. And the deck got better and better as cards like Muscle Band got printed, just allowing the deck to have a great way to overall add more damage outside of having to play like Silver Bangle, which not every deck could use. This deck got a Worlds deck for the 2013 and the 2014 years. Both of them look pretty different from each other, but the deck's still very solid and able to succeed and do so much damage in that format, which is why it is number 9 on this list. Coming in at number 8 is the oldest card on this list so far, but don't worry, we're definitely going to go back in time a little bit more than this. It is Empoleon from Majestic Dawn. This is a Stage 2, 130 HP Pokemon with 2 very successful and great attacks. For a Water and a colorless, you can use Dual Splash to choose 2 of your opponent's Pokemon and do 30 damage to each of them. And then for Water colorless, you do Surf Together for 50, and you do 10 extra damage for each Pokemon on your bench, but then you flip a coin, and if tails, you do 10 damage to each of your bench Pokemon. Both these attacks overall combine well to make Empoleon just a very efficient, strong, damaging attacker. The main deck that this saw play with is Empoleon Bronzong, using Bronzong also to spread out damage onto Pokemon, and it kind of ended up like a very successful spread deck. However, the list that was a Worlds deck was just a straight Empoleon deck with Claydol and some other cards of the deck. Normally it didn't run. The main attack here that we care about is the Dual Splash attack, just allowing this attacker for just 2 energy to effectively just put 60 damage on the board onto opposing Claydols and other threats that your opponent has. With Double Rainbow Energy and Holon's Cast Form, you easily get these attackers powered up on your stage 2s. And then also for Surf Together, just if you needed the bigger attacker later on into the game after you set up, you could very well use that attack, and the 10 damage on each of your bench is seemingly irrelevant. Obviously, other Empoleons have been very strong too, like the Empoleon from Dark Explorers, but this Empoleon is definitely the one that takes the cake in terms of seeing successful tournament play, which is why it's number 8 here on our list. Coming in at number 7, we're going to cheat here a little bit, is the entire Greninja Break line. Every piece of this deck was so important to it, and all of these cards matter a ton just to make this deck the deck that it was, and honestly the arch enemy of 2.5 years of Standard. This deck was in format for such a long time and was always a nuisance on people, just people bantering about whether or not the deck was consistent enough to do well, but then coming out of nowhere and still being successful. I'm going to go through each of the main things. Froakie just has an attack that for a water can flip a coin and paralyze them. Came up surprisingly more than you think because this deck dead drews too much that you would just need to use that attack in a pinch. Frogadier is what I would actually say the most important piece of the deck, just allowing this deck to be successful. For 1 water, you can use water duplicates to search your deck for up to 3 Frogadier and put them onto your bench, and then you shuffle your deck afterward. So if you're trying to get a Greninja breakout, it's effectively a stage 3 Pokemon, so having this Frogadier put multiple stage 1s into play made your deck just so much more consistent about being able to get out these Pokemon. The Greninja normal one, the stage 2, is a 130 HP Pokemon with 2 great attacks. For 1 colorless energy, you can use Status Stitching, and until the end of your opponent's next turn, each Pokemon your opponent has in play in his or her hand and in his or her discard pile has no abilities. This includes cards that come into play that turn. So this is effectively a one-sided Hex Maniac for an attack, and it just caused decks that were facing this never to be able to have their abilities, losing their consistency, which would allow this deck to end them in the late game because this deck would always be behind into hands that were not great and lock out their abilities. So you always had great comeback potential with Shadow Stitching. And then Moonlight Slash, just a solid attack for 1 water energy. You can do 60 damage, and if you return the water energy to your hand, this deck does 20 more damage. So if you need more damage in a pinch, Moonlight Slash is the way to go. And then coming in finally, Greninja Break, Giant Water Shuriken. Once during your turn, if this Pokemon is your active Pokemon, you may discard a water energy, and if you do, you put 6 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. So Greninja Break, definitely the top end of this whole deck, just allowing you to snipe damage all over the board, and putting 6 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon is so much. Earlier on in this deck's existence, that would knock out a lot of the relevant basic Pokemon for the evolutions that were happening. Later on, as Pokemon started printing 70 HP basics, that would not happen as much, but this 2-shot most relevant things in the metagame between 2 Giant Water Shurikens and then an attack, as soon as you got 2 Greninja Breaks out, you were doing great work. Later iterations of this deck played Starmie so that the deck could just filter back those water energies, and the deck just saw so much tournament success over time. Just going through all of the different eras of this deck saw play in Standard and Expanded as a top winning deck. Won a Expanded Regional in the hands of Drew Kennett, who we mentioned earlier. Also saw some Standard play, got in its last tournament of its relevant success, got 8th and 9th at the North American Internationals in 2017, a format that I'm working a lot on right now to rebuild some decks from it. But through the 2.5 years that this deck saw play, this deck was honestly just obnoxious and very solid at what it did. I say obnoxious in the most polite way possible. The deck would just get set up and beat you out of nowhere and just had crazy comeback potential because it could put so much damage on the board so fast. Overall, I would definitely consider this deck just a very solid contender, and every single piece of it is why this deck has ended up at 7th. Coming in at number 6 on this list is Ludicolo 10 from EX Deoxys. There were 2 different Ludicolos in this set, so specifying which one. Has a Pokepower and 2 different attacks. They were all very relevant. 100 HP Stage 2 that has the Pokepower Swing Dance. Once during your turn before you attack, you may draw a card. This power cannot be used if Ludicolo is affected by a special condition. That doesn't sound like a whole lot, but in that format, the same Magcargo that exists in Standard today existed back then too, as both of these were reprints from these older sets in the Celestial Storm set. So Ludicolo Swing Dance, drawing a card that you could smooth over on top with Magcargo was a great combination. For these 2 attacks, for 1 water, you could use Healing Steps for 30, and you may discard as many cards as you like from your hand. If you do, remove that many damage counters from Ludicolo. Against decks that would 2-shot Ludicolo, you could use this and discard a bunch of cards out of your hand just to put them in a situation where you weren't going to get knocked out, or you delay it by a turn just to get some chip damage and set up more. And then for 1 water and 2 colorless energy, you can use Circular Steps for 10 times the number of Pokemon in play, excluding Ludicolo. So effectively, it's all Pokemon in play minus your attacking Ludicolo. Not if they had any Ludicolos, they all do not count in. It's basically just don't count your active, and it's 10 times that. So overall, Ludicolo was used for that attack, but in combination with Swing Dance and Magcargo, helping this deck set up, this deck was just a powerhouse in the 2005 format. Really hard to find data from tournaments during that time. This deck did get a Worlds deck for that year if you're interested in trying that out. But just the ability to stack a card on top of your deck and then draw it was something that this format had never really seen before, and just offered this deck consistency that no other deck really had. You did have decent supporters to help decks set up, like Steven's Advice and Celio's Network, but overall, once this deck could get going, you didn't even need to rely on those supporters, just because you could stack cards on the top of your deck that you would need as you wish. So overall, with those things combined, Ludicolo does end up as number 6 on this list. Sorry about that. I know there's not as much to talk about with this one, just because the records for the internet from that age were not necessarily as great, but trust me, this deck is very dominant for this format and a very solid one, putting it at number 6 here. Coming in at number 5 on our list is Gyarados from Stormfront. This card has 3 different attacks, but we're only going to talk about the one that matters. Tail Revenge for 0 energy does 30 damage times the number of Magikarp in your discard pile. So this effectively reads 0 energy, 90 damage, because there were so many ways to recycle back your Magikarps and get them into play immediately, attacking with a Gyarados over and over again. You might be thinking, why are you not only doing 60 damage? Because you have to have a Magikarp in play to evolve into a Gyarados whenever you're ready. But in this format, we had a very powerful card called Broken Time Space that allowed each player to evolve their Pokemon as soon as they were put into play. So between cards like Pokemon Rescue and a random Combee to let you get back a Pokemon from your discard pile, you could just get a Magikarp out of your discard pile, immediately play down a Gyarados onto it, and then be attacking that turn back-to-back immediately. Having 130 HP was brought up by Expert Belt, which was a tool that gave the Pokemon 20 more HP and made its attacks do 20 more damage, but your opponent took a prize card on it. Seemingly irrelevant, because that damage and HP mattered so much that it turned this Pokemon into a very hard Pokemon to knock out. This deck started off strong and ended up much stronger over time, with the printing of Junk Arm in this format just allowing you to have even more ways to get Magikarp into the discard pile early. In the initial iterations of this deck, you played a Regice from Legends Awakened that let you discard 2 cards to force your opponent to switch their active with one of their bench. They got to choose those, so it wasn't great, but you did use it just as a way to discard those Magikarps, as well as a card called Felicity's Drawing, which is you can either discard 1 card to draw 3 or discard 2 cards to draw 4. Those, alongside of the Sableye that allows you to go first and has Impersonate, so you can get those supporters out of your deck to start getting Magikarps into the discard pile, gave this deck an engine that was very successful and just continued to get stronger over time. This deck got a Worlds deck in its earliest iteration. This was the year that the mid-season rotation happened, so the true most powerful version of Gyarados was never really showed off on the World stage, because that was when they rotated the huge standard just to that very small standard of Heart Gold, Soul Silver through Black and White. So that puts Gyarados here at number 5 on this list, just as a deck that could use so much utility stuff in its deck, just not having to play energies. You could still play things like Warp Energy to switch your active and Cyclone Energy to switch their active, just because you get an attachment for turn no matter what, so you might as well. But alongside the different late guardians like Azelf, Mesprit, and Uxie, as well as the other tools that this deck gets to play like Crobat G, you just had a very strong, efficient engine for no energy. So know that I kind of started the talking point as soon as I was outroing, but here we go. Gyarados from Stormfront, number 5 on our list. Coming in at number 4 on this list is the oldest card that you will see here. It is Feraligatr from Neo Genesis. This card, just a super absurdly powerful card from this era. Cannot wait to talk about it, so let's get right into it. It is a stage 2 with 120 HP and the Pokepower Downpour. As often as you like, during your turn you may discard a water energy from your hand. This power cannot be used if Feraligatr is asleep, confused, or paralyzed. That sounds really bad. Why would I just choose to discard water energy? Well, here we go. For water, 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 you could use Riptide, and it does 10 plus 10 times the number of water energy in your discard pile. So it's 10 plus 10 for each water. Then you shuffle all water energy cards from your discard pile into your deck. Feraligatr was just a crazy powerful deck because you had a lot of really great item cards that you could use just to get this deck moving forward. And just a reminder, everything in the Wizards of the Coast era, they were all items. They weren't supporters yet in this format. So cards like Secret Mission, Trash Exchange, and notably Missy's Wrath were just great consistency cards. Going to talk about 2 of these. Trash Exchange is just a hilarious card. You count the number of cards in your discard pile, then you shuffle it into your deck, and then you mill that many cards. So this deck would just churn its way through over and over again, discard all the water energies, then you shuffle all the water energies back with this attack, and then you play a Trash Exchange, you count how many cards in your discard pile, and it's like a mini trump card effect that you can just shuffle it in and change out the cards that are in your discard pile so that Feraligatr could do more damage. Outside of that, there was Missy's Wrath, which is just an item card that says, look at the top 7 cards of your deck, choose 2 of those cards and put them into your hand, discard the rest. If you've played any amount of Magic, that should sound very similar to Dig Through Time, except Dig Through Time puts the rest of the cards on the bottom of the deck. This putting the cards in the discard pile actually ends up better because you want those there to shuffle back in the water energies with Riptide. So you could choose 2 cards to set up for whatever you needed to get the rest of your Feraligatrs out or your engine moving, and then discard the rest of the cards. But there would be multiple times that this deck would make at least 4 of the top 8 slots at STS events, which were kind of like their regional level events, and this deck did not see a ton of play as soon as it came out. It took the rotation of cards like Energy Removal and Gust of Wind out of Standard to allow this deck to really succeed, and it could easily one-shot other Stage 2 decks for the format, which allowed this deck just to be so dominant. Decks could not keep up with the speed and pace that this Feraligatr deck had. So with all of those factors in, just with a crazy item engine just to get this deck moving, also being able to one-shot everything else in its metagame, put Feraligatr on number 4 on our top 10 water Pokemon. Coming in at number 3 on our list, we are in the home stretch. Taking the bronze medal home is Keldeo EX. This is a EX Pokemon, 170 HP, basic water type with the ability Rush In. So once during your turn, if this Pokemon is on your bench, you may switch it with your active Pokemon. This was great overall between recycling Keldeos back and forth, but also in combination with Floatstone, this could just be a bench switching effect that allows you to switch any attacker out that you need to. And then for colorless, you could do Secret Sword for 50 plus, but the attack does 20 more damage for each water energy attached to this Pokemon. So obviously the main combination with this was the initial Keldeo Blastoise deck. Before this deck was Archeostoise and expanded, this deck saw play with Tropical Beach and Rare Candy, just like any other good old-fashioned Stage 2 deck would. The deck was then powered into a whole nother gear whenever Black Kyurem EX and Super Energy Retrieval came out, or Superior Energy Retrieval, just allowing to get this deck more and more energy that it would need to function throughout the game. Soon enough, once Archeostoise was brought out by Steve Guthrie Jr. at Nationals as no longer like a meme deck, and then Jacob Van Wagner at Worlds, Keldeo EX was the main attacker in that deck, just allowing it to get a ton of damage on the board and constantly just getting those energies out of the discard pile that you would put there with Battle Compressor with the superior energy removals, then Blastoise them all into play onto Keldeo and get this guy going. Outside of that, Keldeo was a staple for a long time in many decks, just as a counter to Gothitelle Excelgor, as the decks could play 2 so that if one of your Keldeos was brought up, you could use the other Keldeo to rush in to still get your attackers going, because the paralysis lock of that deck just caused you to not be able to attack with anything. Became a mandatory tech in a lot of decks because of this Russian ability. The ability has been partially neutralized by other Pokemon that have this same effect. Most notably for another basic, Dawnwing's Necrozma has this effect on it as well in the form of Invasion, but the attack still sees play. Honestly, until the printing of Magikarp and Wailord, this was the main attacker in that deck. Magikarp and Wailord, just having so much HP for Argisois and being so efficient, has kind of become the newest attacker of that deck, being able to knock out everything in the Argisois mirror with ease. But Keldeo EX was just such a staple in that deck for such a long time, just as a great attacker and a great setup Pokemon, putting it at number 3 on this list. Taking the silver medal home, second place here on our top 10 water Pokemon is the infamous Seismitoad EX. Seismitoad EX, just such a powerful, dominant, controlling card that still sees play to this day, but let's go through it. It is a 180 HP water-type Pokemon with 2 very powerful attacks. The main one being Quaking Punch for colorless, so just a DCE. You do 30 and your opponent can't play any item cards from his or her hand during his or her next turn. And then for water colorless, you could use Grenade Hammer for 130, and it does 30 damage to 2 of your bench Pokemon. Both of these attacks actually ended up seeing play with Water Box playing Seismitoad just as an attacker that could not only be controlling in the early game while you get more energies into play, but the 130 and doing 30 to 2 of your own bench Pokemon didn't really matter whenever you played Rough Seas in your deck. Seismitoad EX still sees play now in decks that range from the standard format when it was legal all the way until the expanded format. Whenever Seismitoad came out in Furious Fist, people were questioning, oh, is this card good enough? 30 damage item lock, that is still solid, but I don't know if it's enough damage. But then over time, with cards like Muscle Band and Hypnotoxic Laser and Verbank City Gym, people started to create this deck with a very powerful, dominant engine of just controlling. For as long as Lysander's trump card was in standard, Seismitoad Slurpuff was a very powerful deck that I'd like to take some credit in initially starting alongside of Jeremiah Williams and a handful of other people, just being able to draw a ton of cards out of your deck, have these huge hand sizes, recycle all your Crushing Hammers and your Hypnotoxic Lasers, and then just easily win the game with some healing effects as well. Outside of that, there was a Seismitoad Garbodor deck that always existed, probably the most popular iteration, and then once the deck rotated out of standard after winning the 2015 National Championships in the hands of Jason Klaczynski, beating out Enrique on Wailord, like we mentioned earlier, the deck was still popular and expanded, especially once Zoroark GX came out. So when Zoroark GX came out, Seismitoad Zoroark became a very powerful lock deck, just allowing you to draw a ton of cards, and I would admittedly say is part of the reason that a lot of cards in Expanded have found their way onto the ban list, being Lusamine, Hexmaniac, and just a handful of other stuff due to the power of this deck. There was this universe where they were playing the fossil Pokemon from Plasma Blast just to never have any cards left in their deck and never deck out. So Lusamine would just be their win condition while they were doing these 30 damage over and over again. But outside of that, Seismitoad has just seen a ton of play. Toadtina was also a deck that existed. Seismitoad EX with Giratina from Ancient Origins, just as a very powerful standard deck with double Dragon Energy and double Colorless Energy, allowing you to power up Giratina as soon as turn 2 to lock out Stadium, Special Energy, and tools from your opponent's Pokemon, as well as having an ability that shut off damage from Megas, so just another axis that you could fight all these decks from. Just the powerful combination that Seismitoad has had with all of these different controlling effects has put it here as number 2 on our list. Coming in at number 1, taking the gold medal home for this top 10 water Pokemon is Blastoise. Now, again, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I know that I said that I wouldn't include multiple ones on the list, but at least these are all in the same spot because Blastoise throughout its multiple iterations, for as long as this had a Rain Dance-like effect, has always been one of the most top-tier decks in the format, if not the best deck in any given format. Going back to base set Blastoise, the Blastoise deck with Articuno from Fossil was easily one of the strongest decks in that format. The deck wasn't as great until Fossil got printed because Articuno was the attacker that deck needed to not be capitalized on by its weaknesses. Then moving forward into history, the Blastoise EX had a very similar Rain Dance effect called Energy Rain, which allowed you to keep putting energy onto your Pokemon, but you had to put a damage counter onto it. And in combination with Lugia EX, Steelix EX, and Latios Prism, or Latios Star, which is a card that's not often talked about. All of these attackers could just blow up stuff because of the Holland's cast form that allowed you to get all of these different energy requirements. But most recently, and the one that we'll talk about the most, is Blastoise from Boundaries Cross, later getting reprinted in Plasma Blast. This card is the key to the Archeozoids deck, and Blastoise Keldeo, as how we had talked about earlier, obviously just a powerful deck, but Blastoise being the card that makes that deck work. All these Blastoises just helping these decks put energies into play over and over again throughout all the history of the game, just getting all these energies into play, putting Blastoise number 1 at the top of our list just because of how fast it can get these very strong attackers powered up, just winning the game before you can even know it. Well, alrighty guys, thank you guys for taking the time to listen to this top 10. My name is Xander Bennett here with Rare Candy. If you like this content, please like, comment, subscribe to this video. If you think there's something that we missed on our top 10, or if you don't agree with our order, let us know in the comments. We'd love to talk with you about that. But please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our Patreon if you'd love to support content like this. We really appreciate the direct support that helps content like this happen. So thank you guys for sticking around, watching this top 10. Also, let us know in the comments what top 10 you want to see next. In my head, I'm most likely going to do something that's been around for a very long time, like Fire or Water. Going to wait for like the Dark, Metal, and Fairy ones just so that we can get a few more cards just in case any of those are randomly great enough to make this top 10 list. But let us know what you guys want to see. If you want us to differentiate other, maybe go to items or supporters before we do something else, let us know because I definitely want to be doing what all you guys want to hear. But for this top 10, thank you guys for sticking around and checking this out, and we'll see you here for the next one. Bye.